Right. Hello, everybody. Welcome to Africa Soft Power. This is our second panel. And this panel is on collective threads, digital connectivity, creative power, and global Black activism. My name is Obi-Young. I'm co-convener of the Africa Soft Power Project, a movement focused on how the continent can optimize its creative industries, knowledge economy, and harness its soft power effectively to propel itself forward while championing the inclusion of African voices and the voices of the global Black community in global discourse. Our May edition, titled The Bridge, the Past, the Present, the Future, has been specifically timed to begin on Africa World Heritage Day on May 5th and end on Africa Day, May 25th. Our objective is to establish the celebration of Africa's contemporary industries within wider global conversations, and as we therefore invite the whole world to join the celebration of May as Africa Month. This session explores how creative power and social media have changed the landscape of activism and what the future holds for protests and movements like EndSARS and BLM. We're happy to have Mona Eltahawy, Otosirieze Obi-Young, Sena Voncujovi, and Amah-Rose Abrams on this plenum, and I, for one, can't wait to listen to the perspective they all will bring. Our moderator is the brilliant filmmaker, multimedia journalist, Zoe, one second, please. I've now lost my stuff. Zoe Ramushu, a Reuters fellow at Oxford University. Zoe chairs a committee for the South African Department of Arts and Culture. It makes moderating seem effortless. We're very, very happy to have her here. Zoe, over to you.
Thank you so much, Obi, and welcome to tonight's session. I'm very excited to be here. Thank you so much for having me on, and I'm very excited to have a conversation with all the panelists today who are sort of scattered all over the globe. We're kind of having a conversation before we got started, and some are in quarantine, some are like semi-quarantining, but I think that's the beauty of having sessions like this. We can connect wherever we are in the world, and regardless of being separated and socially distanced, we can connect in spaces like this. So again, welcome to everybody, and I'm very excited for tonight's panel and for us to get into it. As I start, I just want to give you a bit of background on each of our panelists. Very esteemed people, but one of the things that the Africa Soft Power series wanted to emphasize this year is a lot of young voices, particularly when we speak about the continent, about Africa. And when we speak about Black people in the diaspora, a large percentage of the population is the youth. So the voice of the youth is absolutely imperative that it's heard. And I think the Africa Soft Power series is doing an excellent job with that. And what I love about our panel today is that they're not only youthful, but they're very experienced. They've done a lot of things in each of their spheres, and they're definitely making waves. So I just want to give a bit of context as to who we have on our panel, our distinguished panel today. So we have Mona Eltahawy, who's an award-winning New York-based journalist, author, commentator, and international lecturer on Arab and Muslim issues. Her opinion pieces have appeared frequently in the International Herald Tribune, the Washington Post, the Pan-Arab Monitor, and a number of Egypt's large papers. She was a news reporter in the Middle East for many years, including in Cairo and Jerusalem as a correspondent for Reuters, and she reported from the region for The Guardian and the US News and the World Report. During the 18-day, this is my favorite part, during the 18-day revolution that toppled Egypt's president, she appeared on most major media outlets, leading the feminist website Jezebel to describe her as the woman explaining Egypt to the West. How badass is that? Her most recent book is The 7 Necessary Sins for Women and Girls. So welcome, Mona. And then we have Otosirieze Obi-Young. He's a writer, editor, journalist, curator, and media consultant. He's an editor of Folio Nigeria, CNN's exclusive media affiliate in Nigeria, where he profiles innovators and facilitators in culture. He's also the founder and editor-in-chief of Open Country, a multi-platform space for African literature. In 2019, he received the inaugural The Future Awards Africa Prize for Literature. He has worked extensively in African literature. As a deputy editor for Brittle Paper, he standardized and rebranded the site from a regular blog to a major platform. He oversaw the publication of 10 e-anthologies and new writing, and created the Brittle Paper Awards, the first literary awards by an African platform, which is incredible. I'm sure a lot of us know about brittle paper. Currently, he chairs the judging panel for the Gerald Kaz Prize, a South African initiative devoted to storytelling about gender, sexuality, and social justice. Welcome, Otosirieze. And we have Sena Voncujovi. He's the co-founder of Jaspora, a platform focused on mobilizing African diasporan change makers and allies in Japan, and equipping them with resources to contribute to a prosperous and dignified Africa. I mean, for me, this was one of the most interesting bios I've read. I'm like, let me keep going through it. He's currently a Yenching scholar at Peking University and the chief editor of the PKU Africa think tank in China. He's also previously served as an advisor to the Ghanaian government for TICAD 7 and aspires to economically and culturally bridging Asia and Africa. I think that's a really powerful movement, and I'd love to hear more about that. Prior to that, he worked at a Shinanga Foundation in Tokyo, providing entrepreneurship, leadership, and career development training to students from 49 African countries. He's passionate about education, Asia-Africa relations, and preserving indigenous African wisdom. He speaks Japanese, English, French, and is currently learning Mandarin. I'm not going to try any of my language skills with him. So welcome to you, Sena. And our final panelist who we have with us today is, sorry, just give me a second, is Amah-Rose Abrams, who I have on my, just a little bit of an error here. Amah-Rose Abrams, who I'm going to begin our first question with. And I would actually like her to introduce herself, tell us a little bit about what she does. I'm going to put you a bit on the spot there to tell us a little bit more about what you do. And then I will ask you the first question. I'll be addressing that to you. So Amah-Rose, if you can just tell us a little bit about yourself, please.
Hi, thanks, Zoe. I am an arts and culture journalist. I've been doing that for just over a decade, really, longer, but like properly, I think full-time for just over 10 years. I cover art news, and which obviously covers everything everything art touches in terms of daily news, which means a huge amount of things, really. It can vary from politics to current affairs to just general reviews and gossip. So basically I freelance for a few different publications. I've had my work published in the New York Times, and I write regularly for ArtNet News, the Art newspaper, and Artsy, and I do stuff for Wallpaper and Esquire and Elephant. And I have a radio show with it's Roaring Twenties Radio on Soho Radio, and I do that with Selena Godden, the author and poet, and Matt Ebbott, who is an educator and poet.
Oh, that's incredible. Thank you so much, Amah. And I did look you up on your Twitter, and I know that you have a lot of opinions. That's why I'm starting with you. So we'll just get right into it, because we definitely want to hear a lot from our panelists today. So I'll start with you with the first question. In this era of cancel culture and wokeness, people claim to no longer feel safe speaking their truths for fear of being called racist or canceled. And a lot of blame has been placed on social justice movements. Do you agree? Has wokeness become a problem? Can you, I mean, this is a big question, but can you just start?
I'm going to start with wokeness, because I feel like I don't think wokeness in itself has become a problem at all. I think that the word woke has been hijacked and by certain people, and maybe the meaning has been changed. You hear it a lot on certain rightward-leaning radio stations in the UK and London, and it's become a buzzword. For kind of anyone with any kind, it's an umbrella term for some people in terms of climate change, gender identity, race. And I think in a way people have kind of hijacked its meaning in a way. In itself, in its essence, I think it's still doing the good work, if we want to call it wokeness, if we want to call it awareness, cultural awareness, whatever you want to call it, is still kind of making a huge amount of progress, I think. With cancel culture, it is problematic in some ways, I think, but I would love to separate cancel culture from wokeness. I mean, the horse has bolted, it's not going to happen, but I would love to separate the idea of cancel culture from wokeness, because yes, you know, just even on the most basic level, no, I don't want to go and buy my toothpaste from somebody who is supporting, for example, something like Breitbart News. I don't want to fund that with my money. And in terms of cancel culture, I think that's really useful. And also people spouting hypocritical views, people, you know, I think we need to know about this stuff, and I want it brought to the fore, and I don't want to partake in something which is taking advantage of me and my heritage or damaging it in some way. No, God, no. But then I think that being aware and woke doesn't mean that. I think it would be nice if it could kind of separate its meaning from cancel culture, and just you can be aware of things, and you can be aware of systemic racism, you can be aware of climate change, you can be aware of gender disparity, you know, and prejudice without wanting to shut somebody else up. And I think a lot, while it's fantastic, social media has made so much progress, contributed to so many great movements. I mean, Black Lives Matter, End SARS, amazing work has been done. But at the same time, I do think that when conversations leave the social media space and start to evolve in mainstream media, and via the opinion columns and via you know, talk radio and podcasting, it can all get a bit muddy. And sometimes I think that messages get lost in all of that, and that's maybe down to you know, us as journalists in some way, but it's also not to just kind of have the knee-jerk reaction to really important, relevant conversations happening on social media that are incredibly nuanced and complex.
I mean, I think I've seen Mona nodding her head a lot whilst you're speaking, so I'm going to come to you, Mona. Can you jump in on that? Just what your opinion is about wokeness becoming problematic, and, you know, just the way cancel culture is so inextricably linked to wokeness. If you can touch on that and just tell us what you've been nodding about.
So, well, first of all, hello, everyone. It's a pleasure to be with you all today, and I'm looking forward to the conversations and the questions. I was nodding because I agreed with essentially, you know, at the core of this is the idea of accountability, holding people accountable for hate, for racism, for inciting violence, for, you know, things that, because we're all connected in unprecedented ways, we are able to see in ways that we couldn't before. And so, thanks to social media, and I'm a huge fan of social media, I live on social media, we are hearing from people and places that we didn't in the past. And I think what's happening now, and, you know, I see that someone who's watching is asking what is cancel culture, because it's not clear to everyone what cancel culture is. I actually rarely use the phrase cancel culture, because I think it too has been hijacked by the right wing, by racists, by misogynists, you know, by people who are not used to being held accountable, by people who are used to owning platforms and basically whose voices were rarely challenged. And now, thanks to social media, we can talk back. We being many people, you know, not just us as journalists who were used to, you know, engaging with the public and basically speaking to the public, but the public too. And so you have, you know, everyone can go on Twitter and express their opinion. So effectively what cancel culture is, and this is a very, very quick definition, is basically when we see, like if someone says something racist or misogynist, and we decide we no longer want anything to do with that person because of their views. So the right wing now use it and say, oh, you're canceling me and it's not fair and it's cancel. I'm like, fuck all of you. Now, if anyone is offended by my swearing, I'm like, that's just the way I am, okay? It's gonna happen. So I really don't care that the right wing is hurt or that, you know, racist shits are hurt or misogynist shits are hurt. This is a time now where we are holding people accountable. I'm held accountable for my views. Everyone is held accountable for their views. So this effectively is what cancel culture is, where like, you know, I will no longer read this publication, or, you know, J.K. Rowling. Everyone knows about J.K. Rowling, right? The author of Harry Potter. So she is an incredibly successful author, but, you know, over the past year or so, she has expressed horrifically transphobic views that are very, very hateful, are very cruel, and are encouraging transphobes in their hatred of a very marginalized community, you know, trans people and gender non-conforming people. So some people are accusing those of us who are trans allies and those of us who support the trans community of, quote unquote, canceling J.K. Rowling. Now, this is where it gets really interesting. J.K. Rowling is one of the wealthiest people in the world. She is one of the most famous people in the world. How the fuck am I going to cancel J.K. Rowling, you know? So it just gives you an idea of the power imbalance that is at play here. This is an incredibly wealthy, powerful white woman, and she has targeted a very marginalized and very beleaguered minority of a minority. You know, the trans community is the minority of the LGBTQ plus community. So it kind of gives you the idea of how skewed it is, and how the right wing, because they're so used to not being challenged, are now using this idea of cancel culture, which is effectively accountability, to, you know, moan and groan about, oh, you're canceling. Oh, I'm like, you know what? Fuck you. It's good that we're canceling you, because I don't want to read the views of someone who is actively endangering a marginalized community. So this is effectively what we're talking about. This is a time now where we're hearing from everyone. There is no such thing as giving voice to the voiceless. No one is voiceless. If you think someone is voiceless, you have to ask yourself, why? Why do I not hear their voice? Why were they not given a platform? Who was preventing them from having that platform? And invariably, the questions and the roads all lead to basically people who have power and are unaccustomed to having their power challenged, and are unaccustomed to hearing from those whose voices they were used to squashing. So that's effectively what we're talking about these days. We are answering back. And by we, I mean many of us, but we are answering back.
That's incredible, Mona. And I think you've defined it so well in terms of what cancel culture is. It makes me think of I think it was last year, just as BLM had happened, and I had two of my colleagues who are Caucasian phone me up, and, you know, everyone was calling people out on social media, and one of their colleagues from LA, a young white male, had been called out, and basically everybody was canceling him because of, you know, some ridiculous stuff that he had said a couple of years ago. So they called me in a panic, like, Zoe, you know, tell us, like, you know, is this okay? Like, you know, because, you know, he's like a nice guy, like, you know, but if he's wrong, you know, we just want to understand. Like, there was a big panic, you know, and they're like, you know, they were just, I guess, trying to understand for the first time what the concept is of accountability. And they were very terrified. And what I explained to them is that, you know, they went on about little things like, oh, you know, his life is going to be ruined. He's just gotten fired from his job and all of these things. And I was like, you know, this is, number one, this is one person, you know what I mean? This is one guy. And unfortunately, sometimes lessons have to be learned, you know, because yes, it was a mistake. To be honest, he's a rich white kid. He's going to get another job. You know what I mean? And probably a couple of people might even give him a job because he got canceled, you know, and, you know, let's be honest. And on top of that, I felt like for a while, people, for the first time, those girls had to ask themselves those questions. And I said to them, I'm always asking myself these questions. Like, if I say this, you know, what are they going to think? If I say that, what are they going to think? You know, and who's they? A lot of the time it's white people, and because you're finding yourself in white spaces. So I feel like this, you know, the cancel culture, it is very rough, but I think it is something that's necessary to a certain extent, and for a very, you know, extended period of time, until people kind of understand and start being able to think before they speak, you know, think before they post as well. And speaking about posting, I want to move on to, social media activism, because obviously, I was just thinking about it. These are the same girls that were tweeting Black Lives Matter, but they didn't fully understand it. And I want to address this question to Otosirieze. Social media is the power to highlight important issues that might not get a lot of attention, which gives a voice to underrepresented groups. How can activists leverage off the power of social media to effect change without coming off as performative or engaging in like showy activism? I was in New York during the BLM protests, and a lot of people were saying, a lot of white kids just want to get out of the house. So they're just out there like, hey, this is an excuse to be outside and on the streets without being called out for not being COVID compliant, So, if you can touch on this, like how can people engage with being, activists without it being, showy activism? And how do we prevent memification of serious issues on social media, which kind of trivialize the meaning of socio-political movements? If you can touch on that.
Yeah, so I often feel that when we begin the conversations about activism or generally conversations about progress, it's often on the footing of defensiveness. So we have the question of cancel culture, for example, which really is accountability culture, which Mona has clearly explained, on an act of people taking power because they know that the system, not that they feel, because they know that the system would not do it. So they exercise their own power. So, and when I think about activism, I think there must be a uniformity of purpose because there's a larger goal. But when it comes to expression, when it comes to the voice, I don't think we need uniformity. I think we need variety. So it's inevitable that we're going to find people who are going to be performative, but to use them to define, to use that tiny percentage, because again, it's always the tiny percentage, to use them to define the greater movements, because a bunch of rich white kids stepped out to, because of, COVID compliance. Does that erase the thousands, the hundreds of thousands of black, white, brown, all other people who came out who were crying? Because they lost other people. It seems to me like every time we begin this, we're in danger of losing sight of the bigger issues. So I think social media activism is not something that is, for me, it's not debatable. It's not at all debatable, and I certainly do not advocate for the regulation of its language. I think that the only thing that makes power turn to you, and I'm saying this as a Nigerian, where you do a whole lot of things, you do it the normal way. They ask you to do it the normal way. You do it the normal way, nothing happens. You step out into the streets, something happens. And next thing they say, oh, you're insulting people, or you're doing this. So I'm trying to run away from the question of performative activism because I don't think it's really what we should be talking about, the real issues. So if there are people who are going to step out and pretend to care, and by stepping out, create more visibility, I do not mind at all if in the larger context, the greater goal is being pursued, but we still have to be mindful of those people and call it out. But we shouldn't have to make the entire thing. If we're protesting Black Lives Matter, NSAS or anything, and a bunch of people are performing, you call them out, but you keep the focus. You don't spend all energy on them. That's what I think. There is no other one. We also have to be mindful of the fact that it doesn't matter how the protest happens, as long as it's a protest. Power answers by saying only one thing, and that thing is you're not doing it right. It doesn't matter how. You step out to the streets, you tweet, you go on Instagram, you go to a party, you go to Aso Rock in Nigeria, they tell you you're not doing it right. So how is right? So just to pivot it to the NSAS movements in Nigeria. So the normal thing has been, oh, the youth, you people are, the president said the youth are lazy, fine. And now the youth stepped out into the streets. And now the youths who were lazy are now, all of a sudden they are devoting all the energy they should have used to work. They are putting it into insulting people. They are doing this one. And now stepping out into the streets is now the problem. And now they're saying, oh, you're on the streets, why not get a few people to talk for you? And we said, no, it's a leaderless movement. And the narrative they are pushing is that that's the wrong thing to do. But we all know that if you select leaders, and To be fair, there was a time a few people did speak, everybody criticized them. But if we had selected leaders from the beginning, it would have been easy to narrow this down to a few people, target them, kill the whole thing. And we've been down that road several times. We got smarter, they say that's not the right thing. So we just have to, there's no other way to call power to be accountable than to be loud, be visible, do it in your own way. For everybody who's performing, for everybody who's screaming on Twitter, there is somebody who's going to office by office. There is somebody who's seated in they might not be in the streets, but in their company, they are quietly ensuring that through maybe HR, that the rules make it safe for women, for LGBTQ people. It's also a form of advocacy, and that is more important to me than the number of people who ever perform, which is always the tiniest percentage.
Thank you so much for that. I just want to move on quickly because we do have a lot of questions and a lot of subjects we want to touch on. So I have to kind of move us along because I know there's a lot of different things. But Amah, I'll come back to you if you can just keep that on note. I wanted to ask Sena, because you work on, this cohesion between Asia and Africa, creatives are, a massive part of empathy, and stories have the ability to foster social justice and create empathy between people. You mentor a lot of young people in these spaces. That's your platform. Do you find that stories kind of create that empathy between these two regions? Are there similarities that you're seeing? And does that empathy then turn to action? Does it actually turn to action at all?
Yeah, I think that's a very good question. And I think when we talk about even issues about race from my perspective, which is mostly in Japan, it's very, very different from what we see in Europe or in the United States. And I think a big reason is just the history, right? Unlike Europe and America that had a history of slavery and a long contact, several centuries with Africa, a lot of countries in Asia do not have that link. Right. So if you spoke to an average person in Japan, what is cancel culture? They wouldn't even know. Right. In Japan, people are contemplating, is it really racism or is it just ignorance? Because we can't, it expresses itself very, very differently. And I think within that context, storytelling is a key tool to be able to have people believe in your movement or get allies for that, right? I think it's very different in places like the US where you have a sizable African or diasporan community and several centuries of activism happening. In Japan and in many other Asian countries, you do not have that, right? You have a very, very small community. And so one, it's very important that first, among Africans and Black people, they get together. So I'm talking about the difference between mixed Japanese and Black people, as well as continental African immigrants, as well as historical diasporan Africans, such as African Americans. All of these small groups are in little silos, right? But through partnerships, through storytelling, we're able to see the commonality of our struggle. And then when we do come together, then we come as a collective voice. And then that's able to kind of move society and bring more allies. And so for us as Jaspora, we've been trying to create these spaces and have these conscious discussions, both at times when there is a problem, such as these global BLM movements, but also when there aren't problems. Right. I think it's very important that these various different groups are forming bonds between each other when there are no conflicts. Right. Because I think that Black solidarity is very important, but it's very, very different. Right. I think even when we compare the Black Lives Matter movement and its global ramifications, and you compare that to NSAS was powerful, but we did not see it go as big as we did see BLM. Right. And I think it's important to have, both groups being able to cross-fertilize or to support each other. But for that to happen, there needs to be more understanding and more bonds that are formed from the top level of these organizations, as well as on the everyday level, or else it would be very difficult to just get action when there's a problem, when these groups do not really know each other, don't have these bonds. And I think in that element, storytelling is a very important tool to be able to bridge these communities and have shared common identities or issues.
I love what you said there about, people bonding, not just in solidarity when there's something wrong. It's like we need to be bonding and connecting on positive things too. And one of the things, it's also a controversially discussed topic, but one of my colleagues, she's an actress, South African actress, and she recently played Harriet Tubman in the Amazon Prime series Thuso Mpetu, and Daniel Kaluuya, who's just won an award for playing an African-American man, and he's like, I like that mixture of, us understanding each other, us telling each other stories, us understanding each other's stories, which is what you're pointing out, that it's not just when it comes to a movement that we, bond together. We need to be bonding on various levels. And I want to speak to you, Amah-Rose, just so you can touch on your question, on your response that you had, but I also want us to move on to, could you respond to the question, does the task of preserving a resistance or revolution lie with creatives?
Really, really interesting. What I wanted to quickly say in relation to the last question was, I think that one thing that we can't ignore about the success of BLM was the fact that, yes, it was a social media movement, but it was also, it flourished because of traditional activist structures and means, like group meetings, like seminars, like face-to-face, and engaged interventions, all of these things. I think all of this, I find it quite funny, performative protest, people with the old selfie camera, at the protest, it's just, they're just embarrassing themselves, really. But all that energy and everyone turning up, that's another body on the street, that's important. It's like, yes, there are daft people in the world, and there are always going to be daft people in the world, but they still got up and got out of bed and went there and walked for miles and held up signs, whether or not they fully understand the issues. I think it's like, the important thing is to harness that and translate it into real change, and that will always, as it stands at the moment, come back to government, lobbying, reporting, and that kind of thing. I just wanted to add that because I think it's like, if we have those great structures in place with the movements that we want to nurture, then it makes a huge difference. But what I want, sorry.
So I just wanted to lead you into the question. So do you think that the, sustaining and preserving the movement, of course, there's the, the action on the ground, there's the lobbying, the actual hard work that comes after, the big displays. Do you think that sustaining it and preserving it lies with creatives?
It's really interesting. What I found as a journalist covering the arts is the fact that conversations are happening in that space, and I've given it a lot of thought, and I think I don't have a finite answer for that, but there's a reason why climate, gender issues, and rights, prejudices of all kinds are being confronted in the cultural space. And it's one of the only places where you can go, it is very left-leaning, I would say. There are some kind of right-wing galleries and things like that. So it is, so there is a tone, but it's one of the only places where you can go in, you can kind of make your point, you can be celebrated in, it's not a neutral space, but maybe it's the closest to a neutral space we're going to get at the moment. And I think that's why a lot of these conversations have been taking place in galleries and museums. And it's been interesting to see the trickle-down effect of that, of things like, Nan Goldin's Sack Le Pain campaign. Well, it's like, if you're going to have these conversations in museums, if you're going to have these conversations in cultural spaces, but what about the space? What's the politics of this space? and then addressing that and seeing the effect of that in the art world. It is making change. It's not perfect, but I can see change in the industry that I spend most of my time in. In terms of, I don't want to get too far away from your question, but in terms of creativity and with art, I think because the space has that power at the moment, yes, it's a great avenue for people. And it's been really interesting to see galleries and museums address their own structures to some degree. It's not perfect, but also for them to host discussions which far kind of are far outside the remit of the cultural world. So addressing politics, addressing rights, bringing in really interesting speakers and stuff like that. In a way, though, it's you don't want people to be able to do that and kind of art wash away their own problems. It's got to be in tandem with platforming young artists of color who haven't had the opportunity, from tapping into the canon and doing like Frank Bowling's exhibition at Tate, like going, this guy's a legend, this guy is a part of British art history, he needs a show in Tate Britain and he's really old, we've got to get it done. And actually making that stuff happen. You can't just kind of have a nice dinner with everybody and leave it there. It's a bit of a kind of like rambly answer, but I think it's really complicated.
I mean, it is very complicated, but I think you've highlighted a lot of really important ideas to get me thinking, and I think a lot of us are thinking about that. And Mona, I wanted to, just as we wrap up our chat about social media and the movements. I remember, I want to say 10 years ago, I wrote a paper for my MA about how social media movements were going to, cause a revolution in Zimbabwe. And my teacher, like my professor, she failed me. She was like, oh, Zimbabwe is like a 70% rural community. People don't have access, yada, yada, yada. She literally, well, I think she just didn't like me in general, but she genuinely failed me on that paper. And just 2 weeks later, the hashtag This Flag movement, I don't know if all of you know about it, just exploded. It's literally like God was trying to just, have my back in that moment. And she just had to send me a text message and she just said, I guess you were right. She didn't change my mind, but I think I was happy with that text message. But just to wrap this conversation about, hashtags, there's the hashtag BLM, NSARS, Congo is bleeding, just to name a few. What do you think the future of activism will be now that, there's so much to do with hashtags? Like, how do you think the face of activism is going to be changed, and how is this going to impact the future?
Right. Well, Zoe, I'm so glad you shared the anecdote. I'm sorry, first of all. I mean, fuck your teacher. That she should not have failed you. So I'm glad that God took your side. No, as an Egyptian, I mean, I remember, being just mesmerized in the years leading up to our revolution in, exactly 10 years ago, or a little over 10 years ago now, because I began following blogs and the use of social media in Egypt specifically in 2005, and then the years following. And I remember whenever I would speak or write about how important and powerful it was that young Egyptians specifically could go online and say, I count, in a country where they had no access to media, culture, economy, politics, nothing, because it's a country run by old men from the military, So to have young people be able to go online and say, I count, and create a space for themselves in this so-called virtual world. Now, the virtual world is as real as the real world. And they would see other young people saying, I count. And, to see that in and of itself gives you so much power to say, hey, I'm not the only one. But at the end of the day, and I would say, this is incredible. This is going to change Egypt. And I would also be, when I would speak publicly, some academic, and I can't stand academics, they would come up to me and say, this is nonsense. No, this can never change. And, and my view of academics often is, for those of us who don't live in academic spaces, we're like way out there. And I sometimes find academics are like, wait, we have to come up for a theory before you can do anything. And we're like, no, fuck you. Catch up with us when you're ready, And I think your situation with the paper is exactly, and an example of that. And so when Egypt happened, when the revolution happened, it was a perfect reminder of what a powerful thing it is to create a space and move into that space and say, I count. But, and this is a big but now, and I think it connects so many of the comments that preceded your question, it's not enough to exist just in the virtual world, because revolutions are about feet on the ground. So all of those young people who found themselves saying, I count, and they saw so many others, and directly confront. And you saw that happening in Nigeria, you saw that happening in Zimbabwe, you saw that happening in so many other countries where people were saying, I count. So social media and hashtag activism have long been dismissed and diminished, but they're incredibly powerful and they're incredibly revolutionary, but they have to connect to, in real life, IRL activism, because the two bounce off each other. You need, because we're often denied those spaces in real life, so we create the spaces in the virtual world, but they also have to have a presence in the real world, and the two of them keep each other powerful.
Thank you so much for that, Mona. And that's something that leads me actually into my next question that I wanted to ask you, Otosirieze. It's what happens when a government blacks you guys out? That's happened before for us in Zimbabwe, where it was just like, okay, great, you guys like this Twitter thing, you guys like this hashtag movement, shut you down, which is part of the issue when it comes to online activism. And currently, like, for example, in Nigeria, they're introducing an anti-social media bill, to Uganda, introducing, social media tax. What can African youths do to protect their rights to freedom of speech, access to information, and social interaction? I mean, it's a massive question again. But that's something that people do need to think about and consider.
So the first is what we can do, and the second is how we react when we are blacked out. Well, the first thing we can do is to keep on doing what we're doing, because at the center of all calls for social justice is power. That's at the center of almost everything is power, really. So it's about power, it's about distribution of resources and opportunities. If somebody in real life denies you something and you have a Twitter account where they cannot block you, then you should go there and talk about it. And let's see what happens. So the question of, but even when we're talking about it, we have to be, I try to resist this line of reasoning, but that's the practical thing. We have to be strategic, because that's the truth. After all the complaints, after everything we do on social media, if we do not have somebody in government who wants to do the things we're asking for, what happens is, for example, the Lekki massacre. We gather, they shoot us, there's video evidence, they deny it, they keep on denying it, they drag you into panels, and up till now, nothing happens. Everybody goes home. So I don't know that there's anything we can do when you're faced with state violence. I don't know that there's anything you can do, but generally speaking, it's about the systems of power. And the one thing you can do, you turn your activism, online, most of what we do online doesn't really translate to activism, but we turn our expressions, the rage, into actions. So you're complaining about, say, well, in Nigeria, we don't have Breitbart News and, like those right-wing platforms, but we do have platforms that love headlines such as homosexual found, homosexual and the rest of them. So, but the thing you can do is to, if you're a journalist and it bothers you enough, you start your own platform. That's what you do. In the last 1 year, there have been up to 3 platforms that have started as a way to either resist or counter, or just as a way to stand out. So there's a newspaper, People's Gazette, which has been blocked. Its website was blocked. There's another news organization for investigative journalism. There is even the one that I started, Open Country Mag, which is strictly for literature. So I found that on World Press Freedom Day, that was 3rd March of last year. in reaction to something specific that happened within the Nigerian and African literary space, a situation where misogyny has been entrenched, really. People file out to, like defend misogyny because political power was involved. And it wasn't something that I would normally want to do, to kind of put myself in a place where I respond. But I had to think of the future. I had to think 5 years from now, do I want to come back and on Twitter, I'm complaining about something that we could have fixed 5 years ago. 10 years from now, what do we want the people who are, the Gen Z people, when they get in their 30s, the complaints that we have now as younger millennials, oh, we do not have these platforms, these things weren't done for us. There's a chance that we could spend all our time on Twitter activism and not creating the platforms that the people coming behind us are going to have exactly the same kind of complaints. And the problem is we do not know the kind of world that they would exist in and the kind of factors that will come. And I mean, really, everything is about... So there's certain things I'm trying not to say, but what I'm saying is, there are the words, there are the actions. We have to, the bus stop is the actions, as we say in Nigeria. The actions are the final bus stop. You're complaining, somebody in government, you find that an entire generation refuses to open up space for young people. What you do is to fund the young person to run. You are not going to, Nigeria is led by a former dictator, a former military person. There is no way in hell, there is no way in hell, if we want to be practical, that we shouldn't even expect what is happening. If we want to be brutally honest, that we should not expect what is happening. The only way to change this, you have legislature, you have 106 senators, 360 or so representatives, and you have only a few people. So there was a report that came out some days ago about people, the legislature sitting for only 14 days, I think, in the last 3 months or something. You vote in your own people. If we feel strongly about it, we put our own people there to run. So really, that's the only thing we can do. But when we begin to act and they push back and they begin to kill us, the only thing we can do is to continue doing what we're doing. Sadly, it's ultimately an individual decision to decide whether your country is worth the fight and the blood. And I have a lot of things that I think. Nigeria, I don't know what Nigeria hasn't given me anything. So I wouldn't, it's something I feel conflicted about. I don't think, because I don't even think the country belongs to me. If it doesn't belong, and why should I die for it? But it doesn't mean that we're not going to do things that are right. And even the process of doing it, and, we're being killed. It's the ultimate sacrifice. And what those of us who are still alive, we owe it to the people who have been murdered to not stop.
And just on that point, I think there's just so many comments that are coming in. How do you sustain movements? We must keep talking about it. Someone else is pointing out, you don't have to be a journalist to start your own platform. I mean, this is an incredible platform that's also been started by someone. The incredible Nkiru who started this platform, and here we are all speaking about it. Someone else says, if we all keep speaking up, then our voices add up. Someone else says, good point about starting your own online platform, but what repressive governments are doing is shutting down the internet. How do we overcome that? I want to come back to that point. Someone else says, the thing is, we must keep starting and keep going. I think that's really powerful. Keep starting and keep going. So don't get tired of movements. Each time you see something, start something, Someone else says, yes, stay hopeful that change can happen. Keep starting over and over. Next, one of the things that I have one last comment here. You have to have allies domestically and internationally, folks whose ideas are aligned with yours. That's something that I really wanted us to actually get into. When, my previous question was, what happens when you get shut down and you're online? And I think one of the biggest things is allyship. Allyship from outside. And just on this, before I come to you, Sena, I always used to get, my goosebumps when my grandfather would talk about, he used to be part of MK and how, he went and he trained in Russia, he trained in Cuba, and they came back to fight on the continent to help each other's countries get independence. And, you know, it was voices in the UK, it was voices in the US, everybody was standing up together in solidarity to overcome the issues that each country had. There was that collective effort. So I want to come to you, Sena. You're very big on, you know, the connections of us, not only on the continent, but those who are in the diaspora. How do we maximize on these relationships? How, like, I think that's definitely the area that you are focused on. How do we maximize on that?
Yeah, I think this partnership between people on the continent and people internationally, especially the global diaspora, is something that's very important. And I'd like to give a quick example of somebody from our community who was doing that and leveraging the power of the diaspora to continue their fight on the ground. It's the current mayor of Nansana in Uganda. His name is Joseph Matovu. He was himself living in Japan for over 6 years until he decided to go back into politics. And he decided to be in the party of Obi-Young in Uganda, which I think we all heard about, right? And the kind of scenarios, Zoe, that you just highlighted where your internet just gets shut down was something that we heard about, right? But because Bobby Wine, through his global network, was able to raise that awareness, even though that was the case, we were seeing this being publicized everywhere. And when I was speaking to some of my colleague who is on the ground, he got shot by rubber bullets, you know, and they were really being repressed. But he said the biggest thing that they needed was funding, right? Because when the government is trying to shut you down, they're going to be blocking every kind of means that you can, and you need to survive. You need to be able to sustain yourself. And I think within that context, having these links internationally that are not only dependent on your own government are crucial. And so he was able to mobilize resources in Japan and things like that to be able to continue that fight. It wasn't only in Japan, it was everywhere. But because he had these kind of foot soldiers around the world, I think that significantly accelerated their impact as well. But, you know, again, while that is something that is able to sustain a movement and raise awareness, it's sometimes not enough to actually lead to regime change or significant change. And I think we even saw that in Uganda, right? Ultimately, we had the incumbent president still being in power. But I do think that it's important that these voices are being raised. And I do think that it's a time where we need to have more Pan-African accountability, not just on a bilateral, this Uganda's problem or this is Nigeria's problem. You know, it's a big vision, but it will be very interesting, or it will be very worthwhile to have more regional bodies such as the ECOWAS or the East African Community or even the AU have more teeth to be able to hold some governments more accountable, right, when some of these things happen, right? It shouldn't be just the responsibility of the diaspora or activists to be able to raise this issue, but we should have regional bodies that are going to kind of enforce and put their foot down. And I do think that the diaspora has a special, unique role to be able to push for this kind of reform and this change and leverage the human capital that's available across the world to be able to push this, right, and even fund it. So I do think that it's necessary to have it from a non-traditional, but also within the frameworks of government or existing institutions to be able to have long-term change.
Thank you so much for that, Sena. And when you're talking about it being everybody's movement and not just, you know, specific people, there's always the intersection of gender when it comes to these movements. And one of the things that I've seen time and time again is, you know, when a movement starts, it's everybody together on the ground. And then very quickly, sometimes female voices get sidelined, get pushed to the side. And I'd like to address this question, not to the ladies on the panel, I'd like to address it to the two gentlemen. You know, how do we stop this from happening? How do we stop this from happening? What are the things that people must be doing that to ensure that women's voices are, you know, we make up almost 50% of the continent. And a lot of the time it's like the women are put in the front when, you know, just to get the picture right. And then as soon as things start happening, they're sidelined. Can both of you gentlemen just address that like quite quickly because we're running out of time. But that's something that's incredibly important. What do you?
So quickly, there is a sub-narrative of the protests, or the protests online and offline, that happened last year in Africa. And that is that more than half of them were about gender-based violence. And it's a depressing thing. So you look from 3 young women were killed in Nigeria, state of emergency, GBV. In Liberia, there was a rape national emergency. In Cote d'Ivoire and Ghana, child trafficking. In South Africa, Am I Next? In Namibia, shut it all down. In Nigeria, even the NSAS protests, which was not a gender thing, it was to an extent when you talk about, LGBTQ, harassment of LGBTQ people and targeted rape of women. But really, it was something that affected everybody. It was led mostly by women. And you had this beautiful group, Feminist Coalition, that just came up. It wasn't founded to do this thing, but it stepped up. And I think the example it sets is that I don't think, I'm a man, but I don't think that we need to say, oh, women, now you can come in. I think it's all about empowerment. If the situation was just there, you're always going to find empowered women who are stepping up. And the thing is, if you're going to be an ally, then really be an ally. That's which. Yeah.
And I mean, I just to respond to that, obviously as a woman, I know that there's a lot of women. It's not that anyone's asking for space. We take up space and then we get sidelined.
Oh yeah, sorry for my
or subconsciously. So yeah, I hear you on that. Sena, you're in the hot seat because I really want an answer to that. Because women are pushing, but it's something that's happening where we constantly get sidelined.
I think that's a very important point, and something that in Japan, I don't know if you guys recently heard, the Olympic Committee boss made some very sexist comments, and then he got cancelled, right? And those kind of comments are quite common in Japan, and so I think that issue is something that is affecting people all over the world, right? And I think for me, it's important to have women in decision-making positions, not just women as part of the group for representation purposes to say, hey, we have 50%. I think it's about having women who have the credibility and the legitimacy and the background of what they want to do in key decision-making positions to be able to influence, but also for men in these positions to know that that's important. Right? Yeah. Because there are times where you are going to be in a scenario where it's dominated by men and those views become the predominant views of the conversation. But even as a man, when you are having that kind of conversation, I think it's important for you to say, hey, there are some perspectives that we are not hearing here, and that's maybe influencing the way we talk about this. And I think that's why as a man, I think you have to have some responsibility to create that space when you do have the power, right? But also have more women in positions of power and influence to be able to assert their own opinions independent of men.
I mean, that's I appreciate that response. I do. And I appreciate both your responses. I have a question on here. Someone says, well, first I have a comment. Yes, gender issues, one of those things we can't afford to stop talking about. Our world depends on it. And then someone asked specifically to Sena, how are Black women seen in Japan? Is it even relevant?
In Japan? Oh, Japan. How are Black women seen in Japan is a very, very big question that you could write a whole dissertation on, right? But I think there are many different views of Black women. But I would say that the challenges that Black women face in Japan are not just specific to Japan. I think it exists all over the world as a result of the kind of system that we live in, which has, to an extent, dehumanized African people or people of darker complexion, has put them at the bottom of the racial hierarchy. And that, goes into issues of, beauty standards or even issues that face women in general, based on patriarchal systems. So I think those are similar. The only difference I would say is just that the culture, right? There have not been that many Black people in general in Japan. So you might see a lot of ignorance, which sometimes will make people confused if it's racism or ignorance. But yeah, so that's what I can say. It's similar to what people are experiencing, albeit just have some different cultural specifications in the Japanese context. But yeah, it's a big question. I encourage you to look up a YouTube page called The Black Experience Japan, and they go through many experiences of people. On the positive side, though, in Japan, we have more representation now. The current Miss Universe Japan 2020, she is Ghanaian Japanese, right? And I think she's the second person of African descent to hold that position. And so in Japan is also changing, even though we have what many consider an ethnically homogenous society. We have different groups, including Black groups, that are now taking up key positions of influence. That is changing the narrative of what it means to be Japanese or what it means to be Black in Japan.
Oh, that's beautiful. I'm definitely going to look her up immediately after this session. So just as we're winding up, I'd love each of our brilliant panelists, you've each, impacted so much insight and perspective onto this. So I'd like to give you a bit of a challenge to say, if you can wrap up your thoughts and, just give us your final words in under 60 seconds, if possible. I know when I say 60 seconds, it's going to end up being at least 120, but aim for 60. So I'll come first to you, Otosirieze. I know you wanted to wrap up some of your thoughts. I cut you off just because of time.
Yes. So when I was talking about women not needing to, to be asked onto the stage, I was talking generally. So yes, but in terms of women being sidelined, I think it's also important to look at gains in specific spaces, like Nigerian Twitter, for example. There used to be a time when to be feminist is to be the subject. It's still to be a woman who's feminist and popular is still to be the subject of abuse all day long. But right now, people push back, men, women. So anyone who's stepping into that terrain knows that they are going to lose or draw. There is no win there. So I'm just saying it's about the people. We need to also protect the women who, I'm talking to myself and the men. We need to rally around the women who speak up and just protect them from sexism, from, not that they need protection, but like from other, everybody needs protection, but it's always from men. That's the point I'm making, really. So.
Yeah. Oh no, thank you so much for that. And Mona, I'd love you to touch a little bit on your book, The 7 Necessary Sins for Women and Girls, as you wrap up. I can't wait to get my hands on it, just the title. I'm like, you knew it was going to be a complete thirst trap for, people to want to read that. I definitely want to know a bit more about it before I read it.
Thank you, Zoe. If I can wrap up also by touching the last question about women and revolutions and activism, that's exactly why I wrote both of my books. So The 7 Necessary Sins, which looks at patriarchy globally, but also Headscarves and Hymens, Why the Middle East Needs a Sexual Revolution, which specifically looks at the various revolutions and uprisings in that part of the world. And the core question was exactly what you were asking, why after revolutions are women sidelined? And so my book, both of those books, unpacks that. So please go read my books. But I also want to end with what I call the trifecta of misogyny and sometimes the trifecta of patriarchy, because I think it explains why we are pushed aside. Because when the revolutions began in Egypt, Tunisia, etc., my point all along was unless they have gender liberation at their heart, they're going to fail. And all my comrades were like, but Mona, we have to fix this and torture and I don't know what. But I'm like, Mr. Comrade, let me tell you why you're not understanding revolution and why it's going to fail. Because for men, it's about challenging the power of the state, because they say everyone is oppressed, because the state oppresses everyone. But my parting words to us all here is, if the state oppresses everyone, the state and the street and the home, which I call the trifecta of misogyny or the trifecta of patriarchy, the state, the street and the home together oppress women and also oppress LGBTQ+ people. So it's not enough to rise up against the state. We have to rise up against patriarchy. We have to rise up against the street, and we have to rise up against the home, specifically the home, because the worst dictator between all of those is the dictator at home, because all dictators go home. So that's what my books do. They talk about rising up against those dictators. And finally, my newsletter, Feminist Giant, because I have taken on the title of Feminist Giant because Burna Boy, Nigerian megastar, calls himself African Giant. So in that kind of like ethos of confidence and arrogance, which I celebrate, I am an Feminist Giant. So go read my newsletter, Feminist Giant, which talks about the ways that we can stand up to dictators in the state, the street, and the home, and feminist resistance around the world all the time. And I've now spoken much more than 60 seconds, because as women, we must take the space. Thank you, everyone.
I love it. And I'd just like to come to you, Amah-Rose. Just some closing words. Like, I know I asked the gents on, issues of gender, but I'm itching to hear what you have to say on that, and anything else that you want to just wrap up with.
In terms of gender, I think through my own work, through the very niche area of the kind of highlighting of women artists throughout the millennia and putting them back into the canon, seeing that evolve on a day-to-day basis through my work revealed a lot to me about feminism and women's rights in general. It is massive, and it is so far behind. We are so far behind in getting equal rights on any level. When you think that medicines are often not tested on women, was it crash test dummies are the shape of man? There's no crash test dummy in the shape of a woman, or there wasn't. So I guess that means more women die in car accidents. It's so huge. It's so from the ground up. And I think, as you say, as we've all said, unity of cause, and just a general cause of balancing out our rights, and is where we will all succeed. That's kind of, sorry, it's like, yeah, that's what I think. It's about balance, and it's about unity, and I think feminism is a huge part of that. And again, don't let feminism be hijacked. It's great. I think maybe all the conversations that are happening in it are happening because the movement has grown, and I think that's positive. It's like it doesn't have to cover every aspect of women's rights, the term feminism. You can have other conversations as well. In terms of the arts and our conversation, I think it's great to have the space we have at the moment within the arts to talk about rights and societal change is fantastic, but nothing happens in isolation, and any kind of movement that we get needs to be trickle down and needs to kind of expand into society. And let's just keep all those kind of conversations going. It's again early days.
Thank you so much for that, Amah-Rose. And Sena, any final words from you?
I would just like to thank everybody for being here today. I really enjoyed our conversation, and I'm just loving Mona's fire over here. I think for me, I'll go back to the point that I mentioned, that I think global solidarity is very important. But in order for that to happen, when there are problems and for it to be impactful, there needs to be more very organic, trust-based relationships between communities that would otherwise not be speaking with each other, right? When we come together, it's very powerful. But the whole political organization and activism afterwards is going to be based on positive relationships, right? So I think there is a very important need to kind of bridge these understandings, right? And the main reason why I think that is because of some activism work that I've done in the past, trying to bridge or demystify West African spiritual practices, right? And we have a community of people in the diaspora, so in Cuba, in America, in Brazil, and then we have people who are continental Africans, right? And these people are united in that they want to see these traditions be more dignified, but the way in which they should go about it, and how they think about inclusiveness of these practices, they're very, very different, and it's based on their very different experiences. Somebody who was born in America in that system is quite different from somebody in Ghana, right? And so I think you need to be able to bridge these communities and have them understand their perspective, so that when you do arrive at conflict, which there will be conflict, even among leaders, at least you trust each other, right? And I can trust that this leader his heart is in the right place, and that's why I'm going to trust him, instead of just fighting and now destroying each other, which we've seen in many other movements as well. So I think this Pan-African solidarity is very important.
That's a really good place to end at. Pan-African solidarity is what's pivotal to sustain all movements. Just like to thank the African Power Series. Sena almost did my part there, thanking everybody on the panel for coming. I think it's been an absolutely riveting conversation. Personally, it's always incredible to speak to people with such brilliant minds and have access to being in people's brains. So I really appreciate each of you panelists taking your time to come and share your views. Thank you to everybody who's come on today. And I think if you want to follow any of them, I know that Africa Soft Power Series tweeted out everyone's handles. I'm sure panelists, you're happy with people coming onto your platform on Twitter, right? So if you want to communicate or engage further or listen to their views, they're on Twitter. But that's all from me. Thank you so much. This has been absolutely empowering, and I'll hand back over to Obi, I think.
Zoe, thank you so much. It's just an incredible panel. Thank you to everybody on the panel. Just loving the energy and the passion and just that global perspective everybody brings to the table from their own experience. It was really, really interesting to listen into. And I just want to thank everybody and hand over to Nkiri to say a few words.
You got me there. I wasn't going to say anything. No, thanks, guys. This was incredibly inspiring. Learned a lot. I mean, I sort of like said, I actually want to sit down with you and talk more because there's just so much I want to know about what you're doing and your work. The whole idea of solidarity and like, I mean, I really like the point you made around not uniting just in our struggles. Like we need to sort of like work on ourselves and sort of like grow to know each other so that when the struggles come, we'll know how to, you know, operate around that. And Mona, I was just like listening to you and I'm like, I'm immediately going to order your books from Amazon because I feel like I've just learned a lot. We actually need to be ruled by you guys. We need to be sitting down and letting you guys do the work. And I think the future definitely is young people. And not that everybody here is like 15 or anything, but just the energy in the room, Amah-Rose, Otosirieze, which actually means, I think it means to be a king or something of the sort. But literally-
He's worthy to be king, yeah.
Worthy to be king, I thought so. I mean, you are worthy to be king, and actually everybody on this panel is worthy to be king or queen, and I'm really inspired. Thank you so much for supporting this movement. We look forward to having you guys again.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone. Be well.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you.
Well done.
Thank you.
Well done. Great conversation.